Hello, welcome to General Physics Unit 4, Forces. What is a force? It is a push or a pull. Simple as that. No fancy language there. Now we're going to list some common forces right now. This is not an exhaustive list of forces. This is just the most common forces that we are going to run into in this class. Probably the most common force that you will run into is the force of gravity. Some things to know about the force of gravity is that it always points towards the center of the planet. Notice I said the planet, not just the Earth. We can have a force of gravity as long as we're on any kind of a mass. So we might be on Earth, we might be on the moon, we might be on some kind of an asteroid. All of those things would exert a force of gravity on an object. Probably the second most common force that you are going to run into might be the force of friction. You guys are probably already familiar with friction, right? If you rub your hands together, they get hot, and they get hot because there's a force of friction between those hands. An interesting point to know about friction is that it always opposes motion. We can never get friction to help us start moving in a direction. Friction always tries to stop things from moving. Something that you are going to run into a whole lot that might not be as familiar to you as force of gravity or the force of friction is the normal force. Now, the normal force is coming from surfaces, so the floor, a table, a chair, anything that is just a surface. In fact, it could be a wall. But the normal force is really just trying to describe any kind of a force that is perpendicular to the surface. Now, normal is not regular or average or plane. We're not talking about that kind of a normal when we talk about the normal force. We refer to normal in the mathematical sense, which means perpendicular to. So rather than having to talk about the force of a table holding up your water bottle, where the table is pushing perpendicular to the surface of the table, we don't want to have to call that F table. When you stand up, the floor is pushing up on you. It is pushing perpendicular to the floor. We don't have to call that F floor. Really, all these forces are all just pushing perpendicular to themselves, so we might as well group them together, and we will call them all normal forces. Another force that we will see is a tension force. And for those of you who are quite familiar with maybe guitar, you'll recognize that tension comes from ropes or strings or cables or chains or anything like that. Some interesting things to know about tension is that tension is always going to pull. It won't ever be able to push, right? You can't push something with a rope. And another interesting thing about tension is that tension is always going to point in the direction of the rope. If we are pulling a rope to the left, we are not going to get a force that is up. If we wanted to get a force that's up, we're going to have to pull the rope up. So that's something that probably is intuitive to you in your everyday life, although you may find that when you are in physics class trying to do this all on a piece of paper, you might lose those kind of things that you definitely already know. And then we could just kind of get some kind of a generic force, a generic push or a pull, and we're just going to call any kind of a general push or pull an applied force. Again, this is not an exhaustive list of forces. This is just the 5 most common forces that we're probably going to see here in general physics. Don't be afraid to call something another force if you think it's there. So you may want to talk about lift when you're talking about an airplane, or you may want to talk about buoyancy when you're talking about a boat. You can definitely use those words if those words are familiar to you, or you could try to substitute one of these most common forces. Now we can take these 5 most common forces and we can put them into 2 categories: contact forces and non-contact forces. So what are contact forces? Those are forces where the object and the cause of the force are touching. Which makes sense, right? It's kind of in the name. Things are touching, they are in contact. Those are contact forces. So if we look up at all of our common forces, now we need to be touching a surface in order to feel a force of friction. So we would say that friction is a contact force. We definitely need to be touching a table in order to feel a table pushing up on us. So normal force would be a contact force. We absolutely have to touch a rope in order to feel a force of tension. So that's a contact force. And if we want to talk about a generic push or pull, well, we got to have something either pushing on us or pulling on us by touching us. So that's a contact force as well. The other forces that we might see are non-contact forces. So we're talking about forces where the object and the cause of the force are not touching, which probably seems pretty intuitive. If we go up, force of gravity, we do not always have to be touching the Earth in order to feel the force of gravity acting on us on Earth. So we would say that the force of gravity is a non-contact force. And that's going to be the only non-contact force that we run into frequently in this class. Although there are other non-contact forces out there, things like magnetism or electrostatics, those would be non-contact forces as well that you may run into if you continue your studies of physics.